Call our Senate utilities to order, and we'll, open up the hearing that's been suspended from yesterday on Senate Bill 68. We have opponents. The first step is Jim Rossi. Am I saying that right?
That's correct.
Vanderbilt University. Oh, online. Okay, go ahead.
I gather you can hear me okay.
Yes.
I want to thank you, Chairman Olson and other members of the committee for giving me the opportunity to discuss this issue with you. I wish I could be there in person to testify, but my teaching schedule did not allow for this, so I want to thank you for allowing me to call it in, so to speak. My name is Jim Rossi. I'm a professor of law at Vanderbilt University. Here I teach energy and administrative law. I am not from Kansas, but I grew up nearby in Iowa, so I hope you'll forgive me for having that affiliation.
Okay.
I've worked in the energy industry for more than 30 years and have written extensively on topics such as utility transmission siting, the duty to serve customers, and energy federalism. Today, I'm here to talk to you about SB 68, and let me begin by highlighting potential constitutional concerns with SB 68. As you know, last fall, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit held that the Texas transmission ROFR violates the Dormant Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution. As I discussed in a recent article in Regulation, and I've submitted this article with my testimony to the committee, this case has nationwide implications, and thus the court's analysis is relevant to your consideration of SB 68. As a matter of constitutional law, the Dormant Commerce Clause is notoriously complex, but it boils down to this. A state cannot erect protectionist laws that discriminate against businesses who do not presently operate in the state. The Fifth Circuit began its opinion by noting, imagine if Texas, a state that prides itself in free competition, passed a law saying that only those with existing oil wells in the state could drill new oil wells. It would be hard to believe. It would also raise significant questions under the Dormant Commerce Clause. So how would a court address a constitutional challenge to a bill such as SB 68 if it were to pass? First, under existing doctrine, a court would ask if the statute is discriminatory on its face. Now, the Texas ROFR law essentially bans out-of-state transmission owners from building new lines in the state. So the Fifth Circuit determined that it discriminates on its face. A ROFR law, the court reasoned, is discriminatory on its face if, in effect, it serves to prevent those without a presence in the state from ever entering into the portions of the interstate market that cross into the state. How would SB 68 measure up to this test? Now, SB 68 does not ban out-of-state transmission owners, but it does erect considerable barriers to entry for them. For example, if you look at lines 32 and 33 of the first page of the bill, there is as much as a year-and-a-half waiting period for an incumbent electric transmission owner to file a certificate of convenience and necessity with the KCC. And this occurs after the incumbent has provided notice of intent to construct to SPP. As a result, a non-incumbent line could thus be foreclosed from making any proposal to build a new line for 2 years or more in Kansas if this were enacted into law. Short of an outright ban, it's hard to imagine a more discriminatory effect. And in assessing whether a statute is facially discriminatory, it's important to note that it's the effects of the law that courts say matter, not the motives of the legislature. Now, to move on in the Dormant Commerce Clause analysis, this first step of the analysis, is it discriminatory on its face, could lead to a court to conclude it's per se invalid. But if the court does not conclude that, it would move on to the second step of the Dormant Commerce Clause analysis. And this is known as pike balancing. Here, a court would ask if the law imposes a burden on interstate commerce that is clearly excessive in relation to the putative local benefits. What are these so-called benefits? to SB 68. Now, I've listened to the testimony before your committee over the last 2 days, and a number of proponents have advocated for the ROFR as being necessary to promote reliability and protect retail ratepayers. That's their bumper sticker. A challenger to this law, though, could readily call these benefits into question. The same reliability standards apply to non-incumbent lines that are approved by the KCC, and ratepayers are made better off by having a competitive check on transmission line proposals. At a minimum, these would be factual disputes regarding the benefits. And even if you accept that there are potential benefits, courts applying the Pike test would also weigh whether these benefits could be achieved by other less discriminatory means. And a challenger to this law could readily ask, wouldn't reforms to KCC's criteria for approving new transmission lines be a more direct, less discriminatory way to promote these kinds of reliability benefits, for example? At a minimum, I think, uncertainties surrounding a possible legal challenge to SB 68 would prevent the statute from creating the kind of stable investment environment for new transmission, interstate transmission projects that's needed. Now, even if SB 68 were on solid legal ground, I would still urge you to reject it because I think it's a bad idea for public policy reasons. And I'll just briefly discuss a couple of these. First, I've already mentioned how this erects new barriers to entry for competitive transmission. Competitive transmission is important, and I'd encourage you not to dismiss its potential benefits. Proponents have talked to you about their experience with transmission, but please do not ignore, too, that competitive transmission providers have considerable nationwide experience in bidding, constructing, and operating new interstate transmission lines. Many competitive projects have introduced new technologies, such as energy storage and smart grid technology, to jurisdictions where utilities were previously not even considering these in the context of new transmission line projects. Why, as a policy matter, would it be a good idea to take this kind of a competitive check and balance for incumbent monopolists in Kansas off of the table? A second policy reason I think this is a good idea is that competition in the transmission line selection process is ultimately good for consumers. This, of course, is just a recognition that competitive safeguards often translate into benefits for consumers. That includes lower rates, but it includes lots of other things too, including access to new technology and better reliability. Utilities in Kansas routinely use competitive bidding for power supply. This helps them to choose the most cost-effective sources to serve their customers, and applying similar competitive bidding standards for decisions related to transmission could offer similar benefits. States with transmission ROFRs tend to opt out of the competitive bidding process altogether. They invest heavily in and build out smaller scale transmission segments that then operate typically in the local zone or in retail rate base. This simply does not protect the ratepayers in that state. When a competitively built interstate line is built outside of the local zone, SPP's cost allocation approach does not place these costs in retail rate base or impose them entirely on retail customers at the front end. Instead, they're allocated more broadly among customers in the SPP footprint. As an outside observer who works in this industry and who listened to the testimony over the last couple of days, I heard a lot of the same themes over and over again, but I was surprised that a significant feature of the Kansas electric power market that stands out to me received no discussion at all in the testimony. Kansas electric power suppliers produce roughly 56 megawatts of electric power generation annually. Kansas retail customers only consume 40 of that 56 megawatts. This gives the state a significant energy export role. in the Midwest United States. 40% of power generation is non-utility generation, and a substantial portion of that ends up being renewable power. We can all agree that transmission is necessary for and benefits the incumbent retail customer. I've written extensively about the duty to serve and think it's a very, very important obligation that utilities owe their retail customers. But it's also essential to support the power generation businesses that operate in the state of Kansas and that wish to often reach customers elsewhere in the interstate market. Offering these kinds of market operations options for power suppliers work to lower costs for everyone, including customers in Kansas. So let me just conclude by mentioning what I see as the biggest problem here. In effect, SB 68 would serve to handicap regional and state regulators from evaluating the cost effectiveness of the various transmission alternatives that are available at the very same time that they need to be examining these the most. That is, when the interstate grid is expected to be expanding, as I think we can expect it to be expanding in the coming decade or two. Thank you very much for listening, and I would be happy to answer any questions now or to wait if the chair and committee would prefer.
Yeah, we probably ought to hold questions till the end. That way we can see how many we can get through. Sharon Singer? Is she on? Okay, thank you.
Hello, Chairman Olson, Vice Chairman Peterson, Ranking Member Francisco, and the members of the committee. My name is Sharon Segner, and I am with an energy company by the name of LS Power. I'm a Senior Vice President there, and we very much appreciate the opportunity to provide hopefully substantive and thoughtful comments on SB 68. I start with the premise, though, in the introduction to my company, just to give you a perspective. We are an out-of-state company, so let's talk about that piece of it. As a company, we have owned 46,000 megawatts of generation across the United States. We have successfully bid in competitive transmission projects across the United States and won over $2 billion with a B of competitive transmission across the United States in the last 10 years. Behind my company is $46 billion of abilities and capabilities to project finance these projects, and with extensive history. And so as we speak, my company enters this debate on SB 63 as we wish to compete strongly in SPP's competitive bidding processes. We wish to compete with innovation, ideas, and partnerships, and we wish to compete with landowner collaboration as well. We wish to come to the bidding process in SPP with extensive ratepayer concessions because we know that transmission costs are the fastest part and growing part of consumer bills. We wish to offer competitive ROE concessions, and we wish to become a state public utility in the state of Kansas if we win a project. If we win a project in SPP, we would apply to become a public utility in the state of Kansas, and that project would go before the state of Kansas for full approval or rejection for the Kansas Corporation Commission's exclusive right. So my company's plea in this case, and with SB 63, is we desire the opportunity as an out-of-state company to aggressively compete. We are a company that believes in markets and innovation, and if we lose because we also understand that the competition is significant among both in-state utilities and out-of-state utilities, but we relish competition. We hope that as you look at this bill, that you will realize that the nation is in the middle of a robust conversation on the clean energy transition. Cost estimates on the cost of electric transmission is forecasted to be the most growing and expensive part of the clean energy transition. Some estimate that the cost of an aggressive clean energy transition could be as much as $2.5 trillion in electric transmission. As a result, we're seeing a rush across the country for incumbent utilities to try to pass protectionist legislation. So where the wind blows, you're seeing a ROFR fight. And what that means is that companies are trying to say, there's a lot of spend ahead on transmission. Let's put a protectionist state law in place. My company would say that your citizens would benefit from robust competition. My company would say that the incumbent utilities often do have aggressive and significant advantages in these solicitations, but these solicitations make your incumbent utility all the stronger. It makes them sharpen their pencils. It makes them come up with innovative designs. And by just simply granting them a monopoly for a $1 trillion energy transition is not in your ratepayers' best interest. My company would say, do what's in the best interest of consumers on this bill, and competition will be just fine. We think the rules should be geared toward ratepayers, and we think the innovation should be geared toward ratepayer concerns. And in our mind, it tilts the scale toward competition. We would also say that if SB 68 passes, not only does it grant a perpetual monopoly to the incumbent utilities for all of the clean energy transmission that's required ahead, it also eliminates the competitive process in SPP. And so as these transmission projects come before your state, and the state looks at alternatives both in design and in cost, they won't have the benefit of knowing what that competitive process could have yielded and what the sphere of opportunities could have been for the consumers in your state. A good siting process has a good alternatives assessment. A good siting process weighs and pros and cons of different routes and different projects and different costs and different structures. By eliminating the SPP competitive process, when you put in place SB 68, you eliminate the sphere of possibilities and understanding of what those opportunities could be. We would also point to the success of other competitive solicitations across the United States. Transmission competition has been in existence in the United States for about a decade. And in recent solicitations for transmission competition in the state of Maine, concessions and the ratepayer savings for a recent solicitation in the state of Maine were $1 billion. We encourage you to look at Maine's report on the situation. In New Jersey, for offshore transmission, their recent solicitation was $1 billion. And in their filed comments at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they address the issue that competition often saves consumers 30%. But I encourage you to look at their comments because New Jersey filed and said their experience with transmission competition is that those studies showing a 30% cost savings from competition are actually too conservative. And that was their filed testimony before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Of course, this bill is unconstitutional. I think you've heard from the previous expert on some of the challenges on the constitutional issues. But my company is here to say today, we wish to compete. We wish to invest in the state of Kansas. And this bill creates a giant wall of competition in the state of Kansas. And we look forward, if offered the chance, to aggressively bid and make your incumbent utilities even better because there is a bidding process. And we also would like the opportunity to become a public utility in your state and bring innovative ideas to your state as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we'll hold questions. Matt Pazinski, might be saying that a little wrong, but.
Close. Pulowski.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just got to adjust this. All right, thank you very much. My name is Matt Pulowski. I'm the Executive Director of NextEra Energy Resources, a subsidiary of NextEra Energy. I want to thank you for allowing me to speak today. And most importantly, I want to thank you for inviting me back to Kansas in a day much warmer than last week when I was here. One of NextEra's subsidiaries, NextEra Energy Transmission Southwest, a certified public utility in Kansas, is developing a project called Wolf Creek to Blackberry. It's a transmission project in Coffee, Anderson, Allen, Bourbon, and Crawford counties. State Bill 68 proposes to introduce a right of first refusal, or ROFR, for incumbent utilities that extinguish competition and prohibit companies like NextEra Energy from participating in future electric transmission projects in Kansas. I'm here to testify regarding the benefits of competition, which are exemplified by the competitive bidding process utilized to assign Wolf Creek to Blackberry project to NextEra. NextEra's energy presence in Kansas began with renewable projects developed by NextEra Energy subsidiaries and NextEra Energy transmission affiliates, NextEra Energy Resources, over 22 years ago. So we've been around the state for a pretty long time. NextEra Energy Resources is the largest developer of and generator of wind and solar energy in the world. We also operate 10 operating wind sites in the state of Kansas, the first of which went into operation in 2001. The projects have a combined capacity of about 1,700 megawatts and represent a $2 billion capital investment in the state. We'll be close to $3 billion by the end of 2023 with a project that we're bringing online. We also provide approximately $9.3 million of annual lease payments to Kansas landowners and about $5.9 million in annual Kansas property taxes. NextEra Energy Transmission was formed by NextEra Energy in 2007, and it was formed to apply NextEra Energy's experience and resources in developing, owning, and operating transmission facilities to projects across the United States and Canada. We also have a subsidiary called Gridlines High Plains, which jointly owns operating transmission assets in Winfield, Kansas, with the city of Winfield. Our subsidiary here in Kansas, NextEra Energy Transmission Southwest, is currently developing the Wolf Creek to Blackberry project, as mentioned before. It's an approximately 92-mile single-circuit 345 kV transmission line between the existing Wolf Creek substation and to the existing Blackberry substation owned by Associated Electric in Missouri. The project was awarded to NextEra Energy Transmission by Southwest Power Pool through a robust competitive process. The process looks at both qualifying developers and includes current utilities in Kansas that can participate in that process. The Kansas Corporation Commission also reviewed and approved the Wolf Creek to Blackberry project after careful consideration to the state-specific benefits of the project and the qualifications of NextEra to construct and operate the project in the state of Kansas. As far as electric transmission really provides a lot of benefits, including market efficiency, grid reliability, and energy resiliency. The Wolf Creek Blackberry project is a great example of all those. SPP identified the Wolf Creek to Blackberry project as needed to address historic and projected congestion in southeast Kansas, which has resulted in market inefficiencies and reliability issues, causing significantly increased rates to Kansas consumers and SPP ratepayers. The issues that resulted in SPP's recommendation to construct the Wolf Creek to Blackberry project are not unique to southeast Kansas. In fact, multiple studies show that over the next 3 decades, transmission capacity in the United States must increase 3 to 5 times more than our current transmission capacity to maintain levels of market efficiency, reliability, and resiliency. And resiliency is a really important point when you think about it with the recent events of the Winter Storm Uri and Winter Storm Elliott. To reduce the economic impact of such transmission expansion, it is critical that the transmission be built effectively and economically. In organized markets such as SPP, one of the best ways to accomplish this is through competition. SPP has a rigorous process to govern the competition process, and it starts well ahead of projects being identified. When SPP goes through a qualified bidding evaluation process to identify eligible entities based on standards such as financial strength, operational abilities, and other criteria. SPP also has requirements in the bidding process for technical and engineering standards, and bidders are scored on the adherence to these standards by SPP staff and also the independent evaluator panel made up of industry experts. Reliable design is not only a process that SPP evaluates. High transmission voltage line construction is also governed by the National Electric Safety Code, which is fully adhered to by all transmission owners, and also the North American Reliability Corporation standards, which are reliability standards that are governed on transmission and operation criteria and have pretty steep financial penalties of up to $1 million a day. As I previously mentioned, not only does NextEra have significant experience and commitment to the state of Kansas, but NextEra also owns one of the largest utilities in the United States by megawatt hours. It's called Florida Power and Light. We also own thousands of transmission lines at high voltage levels and at distribution levels, and have multiple decades of experience in a state very prone to hurricanes. In fact, Florida was hit by 2 storms in last year. One of them was the 5th strongest hurricane ever on record that hit the United States. In that hurricane, not a single transmission structure operated by Florida Power and Light went down. That's a really important criteria for you, especially with the wind and ice conditions here in the state. Operations and maintenance costs are a really important measure for any utility. And FPL, Florida Power and Light, is a top docile performer in the industry. It's not about cutting back on operations and maintenance costs that would jeopardize safety or reliability, but instead, it's about the efficient and smart investments that focus on best-in-class reliability, which is what NextEra is committed to in Kansas and the 48 other states that we operate in. We often promise to deliver our projects early as a differentiator in the competitive transmission process. Excuse me. Our size and scale help us to do just that with over $20 billion of projects built in 2022 alone. In fact, we are in the top 5 capital investors in the United States for all industries. NextEra Energy is. The strength of NextEra has been built through a crucible of competition. NextEra Energy Transmission leverages the operational excellence, vast project management experience, innovation, economic efficiency to win competitive transmission projects, which benefit communities and regions in which the projects are built. Senate Bill 68 would all but eliminate competitive transmission development and therefore deprive consumers of cost containment, innovation, and schedule guarantees that competition provides. In the absence of competition, as would be the case if Senate Bill 68 is enacted, all transmission projects will be directly assigned to incumbent utilities. And the benefits that competition in organized markets has introduced, such as schedule guarantees, innovation, technological solutions, and cost caps would likely not exist. Schedule guarantees and cost caps have become ubiquitous in competitive bids, shifting risk from consumers to developers. Directly assigned transmission projects are not subject to cost caps or schedule guarantees, meaning that the developer can pass their cost overruns through to consumers, subject only to prudence challenges, which are rare and difficult to win. As far as our winning bid for Wolf Creek to Blackberry, we have a couple features of that bid that I wanted to explain to you. One is an in-service date that's a year earlier than was proposed by SPP. That 1 year earlier means earlier savings for Kansas ratepayers. That's a very important distinction. We are also guaranteeing that with penalties every month that goes by that we don't bring that project in service. We also have a project cost that's 40% less than any other project. That's $58 million less than the next bidder. And overall, robust cost containment guarantees that shift cost overruns from consumers to transmission companies. The cost savings obtained through SPP's competitive bid process for the Wolf Creek to Blackberry project are in line with national data on competitive bidding for electric transmission line projects. In a national study, leading economists at the Brattle Group found that cost savings from competitive process for transmission for electric transmission lines range from 15 to 67%, with a transmission investment in Kansas projected to be at $1 to $2 billion over the next decade. Those are savings that are critical to Kansas ratepayers. Overall, cost containment mechanisms have become the standard in competitive solicitations. To illustrate that, I wanted to point to a project in California ISO, which was mentioned in the concentric report that you heard about over the last couple of days. The builder of that project, Horizon West, went over their cost cap by $4 million and chose not to recover it and stick to their cost cap. That's a really important part of these kind of bids. Cost containment mechanisms shift the risk of consumer cost overruns borne by the developer rather than passed through to Kansas ratepayers. That's what's guaranteed in our Wolf Creek to Blackberry project. It would not exist without Senate Bill 68. Additionally, the competitive process does not increase the time to place projects into service and it actually may accelerate transmission development where developers compete on a basis of in-service date guarantees, such as what we did. Competition is giving the developers an incentive to complete the projects in a shorter period, and competitive developers such as NextEra Energy are offering in-service date guarantees before the in-service dates requirement by the planning region. In conclusion, I urge the committee members to vote against Senate Bill 68. The reason why we urge this is so that the state of Kansas can continue to enjoy the benefits of a pro-business environment where competition for qualifying high-level voltage electric transmission lines delivers real savings to the ratepayers of Kansas. Thank you.
Thank you. Heath Kohler, Spirit Aerospace Systems.
Chairman Olson, Vice Chair Peterson, Ranking Member Francisco, and committee members. Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify in opposition to Senate Bill 68 on the higher costs associated to impose upon Kansas businesses. My name is Heath Kaler, and I'm a Senior Manager for Global Facilities Management with Spirit Aerosystems. I have leadership responsibilities for over 175 buildings in Wichita headquarters, along with 10 other facilities around the world. My team manages more than 20 million square feet of manufacturing space, and we have responsibility for managing the utility infrastructure needs across those 11 sites. As the largest private sector employer of Kansas, Spirit is proud to employ more than 11,000 employees in Wichita. Our highly skilled people design, develop, and manufacture aerostructures for commercial and defense customers. We strongly oppose Senate Bill 68 because it will further increase energy costs and establish higher transmission delivery charges on our electric bills of our operations, along with other Kansas industrial users, businesses, and residents. The higher electric charges are not one-time events. Once approved, the cost recovery mechanisms for transmission infrastructure is embedded into our electric bills for decades to come. We have state antitrust laws for competition to enforce competition in markets as a best public policy. These benefits of competition include innovation, higher quality of service, and lower prices. In 2022, we have a recent example of how competition materially lowered costs for a large transmission project, as evidenced by testimony provided to the KCC regarding the construction of the Blackberry electric transmission line. Because of competitive bidding, the winning contract resulted in saving ratepayers $31 to $65 million. Competition drives costs down for transmission projects, even if the incumbent utility ultimately wins the bid. Eliminating competition in this manner would only increase costs on ratepayers and does not serve the best interests of our businesses, our suppliers, or our employees. At Spirit Aerosystems, we estimate that in 2023, the transmission delivery charges for our utility provider will comprise more than 22% of our electric bill. Since 2010, we have seen an increase of 375% in our transmission distribution charges. We strongly oppose Senate Bill 68 that would increase these delivery charges. The final comment I will make is that the rights of monopolies are enumerated 10 times throughout the Senate Bill 68. The bill proposes to protect the incumbent monopolies' right to construct, right to upgrade, right to own, and their right to maintain new transmission lines within its service territory. However, not once does the Monopoly Bill of Rights contemplate ratepayer rights. We find numerous instances of special non-compete rights proposed for monopolies, but no rate protections are proposed for our businesses, our employees, our suppliers, or any of the approximately 1.5 million electric retail customers in Kansas. We respectfully urge members of this committee to oppose the Monopoly Bill of Rights and reject the higher energy costs that would burden our state. We instead ask that you support ratepayers by advancing proposals that lead to more competitive electric rates for all Kansans. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you. Paul Snyder, and that'll probably be our last one, then we'll go to questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Paul Snyder, representing Kansans for lower electric rates. So when we kicked this off, and I haven't been around with many bills that have gotten a whole week of hearings, so this is a lot. So thanks for all you listening to proponents, now opponents, and we'll sort this out. But let me just take you back to Monday. Tony Clark kicked you off, impressive guy, articulate, sharp dresser. Remind you, he came from an elected state where they elect KCC commissioners. Just keep that in mind. But the point,
week.
the point I want to make, is he said, if a ROFR goes into place, the incumbent utility will build those projects. Because the incumbent can build those projects, the KCC will have much greater oversight and cost control on those projects. It sounds good, but that's not how it works in Kansas. Because we have a transmission delivery charge that was passed by the legislature that allows Evergy to capture all their transmission costs, turn them in to the surcharge, and get automatic recovery. The KCC has zero control over that, other than making sure all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed. So ignore that from, if you thought that this was going to allow the KCC to have more control over these projects, it's not going to happen. Also, you heard yesterday about the SPP process being slow. Several of the utilities bemoan that. Well, utilities make up the SPP. Evergy is the biggest utility in the SPP. If they want to change a process, they can get together and change it. Also, currently, Commissioner French at the KCC is chair of the state commission subcommittee at the SPP. So if that's a priority, by all means, get together and change it, because I would agree, probably the SPP does have a slow process rather. And then also, yesterday was brought up that you should go with the incumbent utility because they have access to right-of-ways and easements. Why don't we have a bill that says competitive providers can pay to have access to utilities right-of-way? That's what we did with the phone company. Do you think Southwestern Bell or AT&T wanted to say, come on in, competitors, to my central office and set up shop? But that's what we did. So I think there's a model that can share some of those assets that customers have paid for over time should be available to competitors. Don't think that this bill is about anything other than economics. That's the reason that my company, or my organizations, are certainly here, because they're concerned about the cost impacts of removing competition. But for Evergy, transmission is a key part of their capital plans moving forward. One of the main things that they highlight very openly with their sustainability transformation plan, and that's their capital spending plan, are the key investments in transmission. And the reason for that is they can utilize the TDC, which when they go through that surcharge process, they get to automatically get a FERC return, which is higher than a state return. And so if you're a CFO and you have $100 million or $1 billion, are you going to put it in a substation where you have to go through a rate case every 3 to 5 years and get a 9.3% return? Or are you going to go through this surcharge process and get a FERC return at 10.3 and automatic cost recovery? That's why so much transmission investment is going there on the Evergy system. So I put in my testimony, there was a chart. The last 5 years, even though we've been in a rate moratorium for Evergy, transmission rates have increased $85 million. And those are charges, once they're baked in, they stay there. Transmission assets are long-lived assets. And so you can easily see over a 10-year period, that's nearly $1 billion. Don't forget, utilities make money by investing capital. So when they have an avenue to invest, like in transmission, they take it. That's why we need competition in the transmission delivery area. The TDC is ripe for another rate increase. Generally around February 15th, Evergy submits a new proposal for another rate increase for the TDC, so expect that next week, and then that'll be effective in April. Again, the KCC has no control over those costs, and so that's just something that's going to happen. Then finally, my testimony also, the previous conferee talked about the Blackberry project, but I think that's an easy example to see that when put to competition, ratepayers saved over $60 million on that one project. So we need to be thinking about what's next for these SPP projects that connect us to other parts of the SPP and intergrid territories, and just wonder if we have the incumbent do it, it's at one cost. We've shown on paper that when a competitor comes in, they drive out cost. So I just urge you to reject this bill, and we can find other ways to lower rates in Kansas. Thank you.
Questions? Senator Corson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question. It's probably for Mr. Rossi. So we heard about how there's the Texas law and what happened in the Fifth Circuit there. Then we were told by the proponents that we don't really need to worry about that, that our bill is modeled more on the Minnesota law, which is in the Eighth Circuit. So could you kind of talk about the differences between the Texas law, the Kansas law, and the Minnesota law? And then, because Kansas is actually in the 10th Circuit, are we probably looking then, if we were to pass this, at litigation going up to the 10th Circuit based off whatever we pass, if that is, again, what we end up doing? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm happy to answer your question. It's a very good question, Senator. First of all, to answer the last part of the question first, absolutely, this would be the 10th Circuit. If a constitutional challenge were filed, it could be challenged in state court, and it could potentially percolate up then to the U.S. Supreme Court. But it'd be more likely that it would be challenged in a federal district court, and that would go up to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 10th Circuit. The Fifth Circuit decision considered the Texas ROFR, as I mentioned. The Texas ROFR is an outright ban. It goes beyond a typical right of first refusal and bans out-of-state transmission companies from coming in and building transmission lines in the parts of Texas that are within the RTO here, within the interstate market. The Eighth Circuit case from a few years ago upheld a Minnesota ROFR. And the Minnesota ROFR is not an outright ban, but is a right of first refusal. But there are some key factual distinctions, I think, between the Minnesota ROFR statute and the Iowa ROFR statute and other ROFR statutes I'm familiar with, and this ROFR statute. One of them is that issue I just mentioned with respect to the 18-month period to file for the certificate of convenience and necessity. In Minnesota, the waiting period is I believe 90 days. In Iowa, it's 90 days. Most of these jurisdictions are 60 or 90 days in terms of a waiting period. Minnesota also would require a utility, if the utility decides to back off on its exercise of a ROFR, to provide a written explanation for why it's doing so to the state regulator. And there's nothing like that in SB 68. So I see some key factual differences that I think that if a statute like this were litigated and challenged, those kinds of issues would certainly be raised by a challenger in making an argument that this statute goes further than the Iowa or the Minnesota ROFR laws.
Okay, let's keep our responses quick. Senator Francisco?
Thank you. I just want to follow up on that question about the 18 months, because as I read the bill, the incumbent electric transmission would have to file their intent based on the time frame established by the RTO. So this is shall give written notice, this is line 21, to the Regional Transmission Organization within the time prescribed by the Regional Transmission Organization. And then after that, they would follow through with their certificate of convenience. So I'm assuming that that 18 months is for planning, not for notice. Is that correct?
Yes.
I was asking
Rossi?
Rossi.
Yeah, well, I'm not the person who wrote the bill, so I can't tell you that. But I can tell you that with respect to going through the regulatory process to get the final approval for this, right? And the certificate of need would be a stage of that approval required under Kansas statutes. That extends the time period or provides an option to extend the time period. The concern would be that that means there's more of a waiting period before somebody other than the incumbent can come forward and make a proposal. Because if it ends up that that request is never filed, then you'd have an opportunity for somebody else to come along. But that could be as long as a potentially a 2-year waiting period.
Senator Warren?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is for Mr. Kohler. I think you referred to Senate Bill 68 as a monopoly Bill of Rights. Can you think of another, and maybe this is a question for the revisor, where else in statute we have codified kind of the right of first refusal? It's often something that you would put in a contract. I don't know if you could speak to that just briefly. I know we're running short on time, Mr. Chair.
So I'm
Thank you.
not aware of any other statute in legislation that allows for that. But I'm probably not the best person to answer that.
And it might be a question for research or the revisor, but thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Pittman.
Thank you. Mr. Rossi, you know, when we look at the study, I'm less concerned about the constitutionality. I read your article. It's on page 37 and 38. It talks a lot about the cost. It says that we're going to save costs, but we also had another study called the concentric energy study, I think was referred to. So we're hearing both sides say that we're going to have higher costs with the other one. Do you have any comment on that, given that you're a professor out there? I know you're on one side of this, but maybe you could comment on, you know, studies and that kind of thing that look at these costs.
Absolutely. And I think the concentric study has some interesting anecdotes. A couple of things. One is when you see a couple of examples, and we only have 6 examples that are presented in that table in the concentric study, they're cherry picked. They selectively show long periods of time and cost overruns. I guess a couple of questions about this. One, I know there are a couple of dozen projects that have gone forward, and we can find projects as well that show shorter time periods and show cost controls coming into effect. But two, one of the things that really concerns me here is we don't have any control group. Nobody here is comparing these projects to utility projects. And there's a voluminous academic literature on cost overruns in utility projects, including transmission projects. I think we'd have to have points of comparison to be able to make any generalization that one approach or the other is better here. And we just don't have that kind of data in this study. We do have other studies, though, that show comparisons where a utility has made a proposal and the proposal's been made by a competitive transmission company that actually do show some cost savings. And those cost savings on average tend to be in the 20 to 30% range.
Okay, one quick, go ahead, Senator Thompson.
Thank you,
Try
Mr.
to
Chair.
keep our
Very quick.
responses quick.
Very quick. One of the questions that was came up, I think, in the last day or two was the local knowledge of conditions like weather and construction. I was wondering if maybe Ms. Singer or Pulowski would comment on that.
Sure. Thank you, Senator, for the question. So it's a very valid question, right? Every state has its own uniqueness to weather and other stuff. I will answer for our company. Again, we own 10 operating wind sites in the state of Kansas already. We have a joint ownership of a transmission line, again, with the city of Winfield. We come at this with local knowledge. We come at this with local people who are ready to respond to any emergency and make sure that that's addressed as quickly as possible. So I think that your point is, well, how can you build in the state when you don't really know what the state looks like? And I just would tell you that the way we're building Wolf Creek to Blackberry is according to what we know in the state. It's also according to what we know from the SPP technical requirements, which take into account wind, tornadoes, things like that. And it's also according to the National Safety Code, which is kind of an overarching set of requirements. So I will tell you, again, having people on the ground and having operating assets for 22 years in the state of Kansas, we feel like we're really an incumbent in the state, and we know what we're doing.
Well, since you're up there, Matt, and I'll go to you next after I want to ask my question.
Mine's for Matt as well.
Okay.
All right.
Well, mine is, why did you guys go to the KCC to try to seal the route and the property owners of the Newberry to Wolf Creek line? I mean, why? I mean, that's never been done in my knowledge here. That doesn't act like an incumbent carrier.
Yeah, so Senator, the way I understand your question is, why do we look at co-location? We looked at co-location because we were requested to do a study by the KCC, not the other way around. The reason why KCC, well, at KCC can explain for themselves why they asked us to do the study, But I will tell you that there was a concern with occupying potentially more land than the landowners in some of those areas needed. It's also a span of only about 20 miles of the entire 92-mile line. But again, the request for that study came from the KCC. Evergy and NextEra went back to perform the study to bring results back to the KCC, which they're currently evaluating. Does that answer your question?
That's, I've heard your point, okay?
Got it.
Thanks. Senator Bowers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here as well. Just real quick, I've heard KCC mention with rates of who they regulate, what they regulate, but do they regulate your rates for cost recovery for NextEra?
Currently, or with the Wolf Creek to Blackberry line?
How about both?
Yeah, both, absolutely. So they do not regulate us from an independent generator perspective currently. So our wind sites are under what's called power purchase agreements with specific customers. Those customers sign bilateral agreements with us. They can include anybody from a co-op, muni, corporate customer, anybody else. In the future, yes, they will govern, and that's why they're reviewing the Wolf Creek to Blackberry project, because they will govern us as a certified public utility in the state of Kansas. We also have oversight at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for wholesale rates as well. So multi-levels of regulation.
I'm glad you answered it for both. That's very helpful.
Yeah, absolutely.
Other questions? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is for Ms. Singer from Southwest Transmission. I appreciated some of your comments and how you thought we might be needing to look at alternatives such as siting. My understanding is the SPP is not involved in the siting process. So how would an oversight of the SPP at all affect savings on siting?
Sure. So let me try to tackle that. So basically, the competitive bid process is run by SPP. And in the competitive bid process, part of their evaluation is looking at your capabilities and local capabilities as well, and your ability to execute, as well as cost and your operations and maintenance schedule. And then at the point when a project is awarded by SPP, essentially what you are being awarded is the ability to recover the cost of that project from SPP ratepayers in many states. But the siting of the project is handled by the Kansas Corporation Commission. So basically, if you think about it, what SPP is doing is they're essentially awarding a commercial business model. They're basically saying, if you go through the competitive process, then this is the entity that has the ability to pay for the project from ratepayers on a multi-state basis. And then the siting and the construction of the project, that's permitted before the Kansas Corporation Commission. And that is absolutely the KCC's decision on whether or not to accept or deny that project. And that's their sole determination.
Okay, let's see. Got 3 minutes. Senator Pittman, you're our last.
Ms. Singer, I'd just ask, when you just talked about the competitive bid process, maybe you could comment on that. Do you think it's a fair process, and do you think it's transparent to the ratepayers out there?
Yes, I do. At the end of the bidding process, SPP puts together a very extensive bidding process, and part of the requirements of that bidding process is that it has to be transparent on why the person or the entity that won, why did they win, and why did they lose. And I think that SPP has done a good job in that manner. In terms of their selection process, I think there's probably things that as competition is run, there's always things they can improve on. But as one of the witnesses testified, I completely agree that the SPP process can improve in continuing to do lessons learned from bidding process to continue to improve their process as well.
Okay, with that, we got, I think, some people waiting for the room, and we probably should have been out of here sooner, so we'll suspend the hearing until tomorrow. We're adjourned. Thank you.